Hello, colleagues. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this webinar. So we'll just about wait for a minute and then start off. So please, appreciate your patience. Thank you so much. Stay with us. So I think so we have all the panelists and colleagues joining us. So let's start off the conversation as more and more friends and colleagues join. So welcome back again, everybody. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome joining us, from different time zones, and thanks for joining us today for this 6th edition of the Resilient Urban Systems webinar series, which is jointly organized by UNDP and UNDRR over the past 1 year. So as we all know, cities, municipalities, and urban centers have emerged as development spearheads, while also being key to the realization of the aspirational 2030 agenda. Be it the SDGs, the Climate Change Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, and the Sendai Framework, increasingly a confluence of needs, priorities, as well as action is manifest at the city level. An MCR 2030 survey of local governments revealed a consistent concern in terms of accessing risk financing options, access to disaster climate risk finance has become a major impediment hampering risk-informed development efforts. This resource crunch assumes critical dimensions in small and medium cities, where much of their budgetary resources are barely sufficient to maintain ongoing administrative functions and day-to-day services. This entails enhancing the capacities of municipalities for finance, as well as for developing investable projects, duly informed by risk considerations. UNDP and UNDRR have been supporting cities with policy, programmatic and technical efforts to augment municipal finances, and our interventions are mainly focused around 4 key areas. 1, to augment local or domestic revenue streams and identify additional revenue streams which can be added on to the existing ones. 2, to foster closer interface between the national policies, frameworks, and budget with their application at the city level to enable cities to tap into these national budgetary resources. 3, to build capacities to develop investable projects to tap into international financing streams. And lastly, to enhance their absorption and effective utilization capacities. Noting the UN Secretary General's exhortation that SDGs can only be reached if they are reached at each of the different municipalities, it means greater efforts to augment urban finances to advance risk-informed urban development and contribute to the overall resilience and sustainability objectives need to be ramped up. The Resilient Urban Webinar System Series has in recent months deliberated on issues intrinsic to fostering urban resilience action at city and municipal levels, with a focus of the previous editions of this webinar series being on risk-informed urban development, health resilience, food security issues related to avoiding disasters, and the last one on building resilience to heat waves and urban heat island effects. But in today's webinar, we will focus on the need to augment municipal finance to advance resilience and sustainability action at city level. We have with us an eminent panel of experts and practitioners from the IFIs, the private sector, City Development Fund, and Cities Climate Finance Initiative, with deep insights into the issues, challenges, and the solutions related to augmenting municipal finance. Given this spectrum of expertise around the table, I am sure we will have an opportunity to look at the issue from a range of perspectives and delve a bit deeper into it. With this, let me turn to the very first speaker of the day today. Let me invite Rob Pilkington, who is a senior urban finance specialist leading the World Bank's City Resilience Program. With over 15 years of experience in the planning and financing of infrastructure and urban land investments, Rob specializes in helping governments identify opportunities to collaborate with the private sector as an implementing partner, as well as a potential source of finance. He holds a master's in applied economics and is a CFA charter holder. Rob will be sharing his insights on the need to foster closer interface or connect between the national policies, frameworks, budgets, and their city level application to enable cities tap into the budgetary resource allocations, focusing on the theme of revenues and the importance of considering these throughout the planning to implementation chain. Over to you, Rob, for the next 30 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv, and good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everybody out there. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few of the experiences from the City Resilience Program. Rajiv, you mentioned something very important, which is about revenues and municipal finance. So although we'll try and talk a little bit more widely, in the end, in our view in the program, much of the success and the degree to which cities will be able to rise to the challenge of meeting not just their climate objectives, but also their general development goals is very much dependent on the ability to identify and secure revenues. So I think firstly, I'd just like to give a few words about the City Resilience Program. We've been working for about 6 or 7 years now, supported by the Swiss and the Austrian governments to help cities identify hazards, and then to work from hazards to think through, okay, what does this mean in terms of the kinds of investments we should make? And from there, how do we move to actual implementation? And I think this has given us a very good insight for Rajiv, what you mentioned today, being the topic of my discussion, kind of trying to move all the way from planning through to implementation. To give an idea of order of magnitude, we help 20 to 25 cities a year with in-depth support, and we've supported about $4.2 billion worth of resilience investment to date. So before we get onto the revenue part of what I wanted to contribute, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the institutional challenges we see. And I think the first one I wanted to highlight was the transition as projects move through the value chain from planning to implementation. They move between different departments and in some cases different levels of government. And in our experience, this is problematic. It's not to say that it shouldn't happen, because of course it needs to. But we see lots of inefficiencies and delays and additional costs that are generated by the need for coordination and the need for transition. And this is no one's fault, really. This is just a natural function of us being humans and the way we organize ourselves, and we see it in the IFIs as well. So we've focused particularly over the last number of years on thinking about silo breaking, thinking about multidisciplinary teams, and thinking about continuity. So what does this mean? This means, for example, we've worked in South Africa over the last couple of years on an 18-month program where we try to involve finance officials from the very start. So when we're looking at climate hazard mapping, why don't we try to involve people from units of government which will be involved further down the stream, but who may not naturally want to come or be interested in coming to that kind of session? And the idea is that then, they may only come for a day, it may only be one person. But over time, when you then go to the finance function and you say, we'd like support for a certain investment, they already have an idea as to why that investment is important and why you're proposing it. This, however, is not really enough. So even resolving this, we still see a significant problem in the actual decision-making between development of concepts of solutions and then the decisions that are needed to be taken to move those into city investment pipelines. In some cases, the responsibility is not at the city level, it may be at provincial or national level, and ensuring that those decisions don't just get taken well, but they get taken promptly. Because quite often we see much information available, but then significant delays to the actual decision making, resulting in pipelines of 2, 3, 4 years from someone coming up with a good idea to a final decision about whether this should be procured. So a couple of suggestions that we have here is finding ways to include resilience into the capital prioritization process. So every city, every level of government will have a different approach to doing that. And this is okay. And there are many, many different priorities that cities need to incorporate into how they decide to allocate funding. But it's really critical that we hardwire adaptation and resilience into those calculations such that it's not just an afterthought. It's not something that requires an ad hoc lobbying, but it's something that decision makers actively look for and don't just expect from the climate teams in their governments, but also expect from all parts of government. The second is finding ways to speed up contracting of professional services. So this sounds very simple, but in reality, for most investments to move forward, cities and governments will need some form of professional support. And this may be capacity related in terms of knowledge. It may also just be that it just makes more sense to outsource certain tasks. And this is just completely normal in kind of every walk of life. But it can take a long time. So how can we move this? How can we speed this up? How can we ensure that what we're doing currently that takes a year, takes a month? How can we ensure that when we contract a firm, that we don't just contract them for one task, we contract them for 10? And then this leads, I think, to the third part of this, which is to think about standardization. And of course, we can't standardize everything, but to what extent can we think about using the same kind of contracting documents? We're going to change the meat inside them, but once we know we have a framework that works, that our local market understands, let's try and use the same. Let's share it. Let's share it between levels of government. Let's share it across government. And let's try to reduce the transaction time and cost for all of these investments that we need to make. So I'm going to pivot now slightly, and I wanted to just think a little bit about resilience versus mitigation. So, many of us would have seen mitigation kind of racing ahead. We see solar panels everywhere. We hear about the commercial success of certain mitigation investments. We hear about the simplicity of explaining many of these. Resilience is not really the same. Resilience is much more site-specific. It's much more complicated. And in general, it doesn't generate cash flows. So for the next few minutes, I wanted to talk about this lack of money. So some of us will be finance people, economists, and this is kind of interesting. For others of us, this is where we get a little bit distracted and start thinking, well, maybe I don't want to be involved in spreadsheets. I want to be looking at something else. But it really, really is critical to think about what are the cash flows that the interventions that we are thinking about could generate. Now, this doesn't mean we're doing PPPs everywhere. This does not mean that cash flows are going to pay for everything, but we need to think systematically about where cash flows are, who they're accruing to, and to what extent does it meet public policy objectives to capture some of those back for municipal finances. So I wanted just to share a few slides here, just to keep all of our attention as we walk through the next few minutes. So the first one is, I wanted to talk a little bit about municipal services, and in this case, solid waste management. So what we're seeing here is a picture of a landfill or dump in Kampala in Uganda. And so this will be familiar to many of you who work in the solid waste sector. What the issue is that we find across solid waste work is there may be a very clear acceptance of the need for investment. There may be a social or political case to do something about it. But when you come to the question of who's going to pay for this, not just a capital expense, which may be funded through a development bank or other concessional lender, but who's going to pay the 50% of the life cycle costs which relate to operation of this asset? Who's going to pay to make sure that the right staffing is available, the right machinery is there and functioning, and that the new landfill meets the sustainability objectives that it has over time? And so in Kampala, we spent a little bit of time saying, well, can we do something a bit more creative than just saying the government needs to pay for this? And we did a willingness to pay survey with households and businesses, where what we did is we tried to pitch quite carefully the project and explain in some detail, bringing households into the conversation to explore what they thought were solid waste issues in the city, to explain what the technical needs were in terms of investment, and then to elicit from them through a stated preference technique, what kind of affordability or willingness would they have to pay above and beyond what they currently pay for collection. And it doesn't really matter if we're not going to go into the details of this slide, but the point was that we collected a lot of very rich information, which allowed us to explain to decision makers how households and how businesses view the sector in terms of the impact or the interface with their own lives, and where is it that they see value and that they would be willing to pay. The short of this story is that we were quite surprised to see an average willingness to pay of about $1.50 per household per month. Now, this might not sound a lot, but when you add this up, and of course, assuming an efficient collection method, this could cover about half of the annual costs of the landfill. So, very important. And if this is a finding that if we can generalize, is potentially transformative in the sectors of wastewater treatment and solid waste management. So now I think I just have 2 minutes or so left. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Dar es Salaam. So in Tanzania, this is a picture of the Zimbazi Basin, which runs straight through the central business district of Dar. And it floods very regularly, which is why it's not particularly developed, but it's also something that the city has been interested for a while in doing something about. So we're working with the World Bank team here to say, okay, we've secured, or the World Bank team and the government have secured $260 million of flood mitigation investment. But how can we think about what that will mean in terms of the land? So here what we see on the top left is identified parcels around the basin which could be used for development. And so sometimes we get nervous talking about development in the private sector. But in the end, if we want cash flows, we need to allow the private sector to use their creativity, to use their understanding of what will add value to develop parts of our city. So the question here was, how do we keep a balance here? How do we ensure that we understand the potential wealth generation the private sector might achieve? And how do we decide to what extent do we want to see that be fully developed? And to what extent do we want to combine that wealth, the financial payments to the city which might come from that wealth generation, with other things, for example, the provision of affordable housing. And in the case of Dar, we were able to come up with estimates for a potential wealth generation of around $1 billion over the life cycle of this development, including approximately 1,500 affordable housing units and a contribution of around $50 million towards the costs of trunk infrastructure. So I kind of wanted to stop here and just say thank you to everybody. There's a QR code on the screen. This will take you to the LinkedIn profile for the City Resilience Program. We'd love as many of you out there who are interested to join, and it's where we share information, and we'd love to see your stories as well. Thank you very much, Rajiv.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for sharing the experiences from the City Resilience Program and for highlighting some of the issues and the challenges that need to be kept in mind when we are working towards supporting cities, either around the revenues or the municipal finance side of the things. You highlighted the institutional challenges and the need for coordination across. So I think the emphasis around systems thinking and approach to optimize the resources available is very well noted. In the emphasis, secondly, about how the decisions are taken, and they are taken well and also promptly. So there is a need to have that a definitive idea of the kind of decisions that are being taken, and they are being taken in a well-analyzed way. And of course, connecting the planning to the implementation phase is important. by also engaging and involving different parts of the government or the system that is, there. The resilience, point is very well taken. We definitely need, as practitioners, to build a very attractive business case for investments in this aspect, and we definitely need to make resilience investments more attractive, more smarter, and some of those issues that we normally approach from a different lens need, as you mentioned, from the socio-political, to build a socio-political case for investments in resilience building. So points very well taken. Thank you so much for sharing these experiences and illustrating these examples from your work in Uganda as well as Nigeria. So thank you so much. So now moving on from an IFI perspective to the private sector engagement with infrastructure resilience at the city level, I am happy to invite Pascal Capizzi, who is Associate Director and a Resilience and Adaptation Leader for the Europe region and works with Arup. Arup and UNDP have recently undertaken some research initiatives with some cities in the Eastern Europe and the Central Asian region. And it'll be great to benefit from the learning emerging from that analysis. Pascal will be speaking to us on financing resilience in cities, lessons learned from the experience of cities in the European region. So over to you, Pascal, for the next 13 minutes. And thank you so much for joining us today. Pascal, are you there?
And thank you for having me, Rajiv. Now I was looking for the button to share my screen. Just as I do that, I should probably start to introduce Arup very quickly. Arup is in fact born as an engineering firm back in 1947. It was founded by Sir Ove Arup, and since then, for the last 78 years, we've been developing some of the most iconic buildings in the world, but also, and probably more importantly for here, really focusing on developing city resilience. So we developed, for example, the City Resilience Index back in 2014, and since then we've been helping the 100 Resilient Cities framework first, and then been pioneering many of the frameworks of resilience. But what I want to share with you today, it's a bit of a view. Can you please confirm that you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Sure.
Cool. All right. So what I would like to share with you is kind of some of the things we're observing as practitioners globally, which is the following. There's really a trend in what we're seeing in even at city level, even infrastructure, and even with typical clients that would normally not take climate change or disaster risk as the first thing they look at. And definitely not in their transactions and in their finance concerns, way more seriously. For me, one of the drivers is the realization that, as you can see on the screen, this is a carbon emissions for the year 2021, that we entered COP28 with a projection of an increase of 2.9 degrees. So we're basically very late in our mitigation objectives, as our colleague mentioned before. So there's starting to be a realization on that. The second one, that's if you want, is the one that UNDRR knows very well, and so does UNDP, is the fact that climate risks are materializing in many of the countries and in many of the cities of the world. Every year, every month, we have an indication of this or that type of impact, being this destructive, like a flood or a cyclone, or being this non-destructive yet transformational, like heat waves, etc. So there's a realization of the need to integrate really resiliency into the transactions, into development of infrastructure, into development of budgeting programs. The third element, which I see as a positive development personally, is finally regulation, whether starting from the voluntary regulations of TCFD, going into the EU taxonomy, which as of 2026 will demand any economic activity that is developing infrastructure, but also other type of economic activities, to demonstrate their alignment to 6 objectives, one of which is climate adaptation, which means that in fact to unlock finance, for example, for any European Union funding or any fund that can be traced back to Europe, you'll have to demonstrate if you are in an economic activity with certain certain relevance, that you are actually complying with this. So these three kind of drivers for us are pushing, in fact, cities into developing this integration of resilience much more than before, and hopefully much faster. These are some of the examples we've been working in of late, where we actually started to integrate resilience much more into the development of master plans and actual infrastructure, actual structure and infrastructure of a certain level that take into account, like in this case, for example, not only the destructive forces of high winds and floods, but also the potential drought issues that can have an effect on the city. So in this particular case, for example, it's a stadium. So in a city of Florence, which has been designed according to EU taxonomy regulation on climate adaptation, and is considering the reuse of water within the stadium in a way that can actually benefit not only the resilient and adaptive use of the stadium itself, but actually also send back water, or at least not wave in the water resources in the entire cities on the neighborhood of Florence. So this is coming in more and more. At global level, we're seeing that for example, unlocking nature-based solutions is passing very much through a financial and funding element. For example, this is the municipality of Shanghai City Authority, that back in 2017 had a very, very traditional type of master plan for the flood management and water management. We helped them to identify opportunities to actually do water master plan focusing on nature, which resulted in saving $10 billion just going through nature instead of traditional grey infrastructure that is actually now being invested on. So that money could actually be unlocked for many different other things. We've been working with the Green Climate Fund to actually develop business cases or a methodology for business cases of climate resilience into transactions at infrastructure level, of course, but also municipality level, identifying scenarios today, scenarios in the future, and then really looking into these three components. Is it effective to reduce risk, that particular infrastructure? Is it viable from a financial standpoint? And finally, is it operationally feasible? And that would give kind of a step-by-step method to build at city level actual projects that are that deliver climate resilience, but at the same time are also financially viable. And as a matter of scale, for example, this is a project in Peru. We are still working on. It's the largest finance to construction project I have personally been involved in, that involves nature-based solutions. It's $5 billion that have been spent to reconstruct better after 2017, which basically has a number of components of climate resilience, mobilize finance in a certain way, demonstrated as a social cost benefit value in bringing resilience into the improved reconstruction, and also applies nature. Having said that, what I'm trying to convey here is we see a movement, we see a trend towards integration of resilience more closely into the actual transactions, to the actual priority setting of many of the clients we work with, being those developers, national government, municipal governance, etc. However, some of the research we've done for the World Bank before I enter into the actual part that we wanted to share with you quickly today is that these are the four key issues we're seeing globally in terms of the municipalities to be able to really integrate finance into their programming upstream and downstream for disaster risk management and resilience in general. So these are some of the work we've done for the World Bank globally. We compared tens of different countries and municipalities in their capabilities to unlock finance for resilience. And we realized that these are, in a nutshell, really, in extreme synthesis, the four issues all municipalities around the world are struggling with. First of all is this idea of upstream budgeting and programming. I know this is not a novelty for anyone here, but this is what we're learning from many countries, many cities in the world. So the difficulties in upstream budgeting and programming with risk reduction and resilience at the core, which basically impacts the upstream forecast on the finance that would be available when a disaster strikes. It diminishes the ability to reduce risk and investing in prevention. It doesn't allow for contingency. It definitely doesn't allow for post-disaster. So that's the first element of understanding beforehand upstream how resilience can be financed downstream. The second big issue we're seeing everywhere, and when I say everywhere, it's from Armenia and Georgia to Zimbabwe, is this usual dichotomy between the national level and the local level in the allocation of resources, which obviously has a very specific then implication in post-disaster response and emergency in particular. The third element is the conflict that exists in an environment of conflict for resources and limited resources, between having to respond, having to reconstruct quickly and reconstruct better. And there's a we have observed a dichotomy that can't really be sorted, as for now, at least not in our experience, between recovering fast and rebuilding fast, and then rebuilding better. And that is very often a matter of finance and how much we want to spend for the particular reconstruction. And finally is the element of risk transfer in the insurance, or rather I should say reinsurance market. It's something that we've been working on with very large insurance companies now that bring in the adaptation agenda much higher in their priorities. But the reality is that even then they realize that the municipality is not a client for the insurance world. Reinsurance might cover a little bit of that angle, but it's definitely an issue for larger insurance company to go to a municipality and insure, for example, a scheme of nature-based solutions or a scheme of risk reduction in a particular city. There's many actors in between. The supply chain of that insurance is very fragmented, and that's one of the key elements. This is where, with the time I have left, I would like to share a little bit of what we've been doing for the Mayors for Economic Growth, which goes at the bottom, or tries to go at the bottom of all these challenges to try and identify the bottlenecks for the municipality to program and budget in a certain way, to identify, yes, sources of revenue for resilience and for sustainability more in general, and then to remove some of those bottlenecks and improve their ability to generate local economy and that finance from the bottom up, but also to attract finance from IFIs more effectively. We identified a number of bottlenecks which are recurring. This is in 5 Eastern Europe countries. This is where so I should go back here. The Mayors of Economic Growth is the initiative, is funded by the European Union, and UNDP asked ARAP to help them with developing an initiative for improving the ability of municipalities to generate, attract, and manage funding and finance for sustainability. So we started by identifying the bottlenecks. None of those bottlenecks will probably be a surprise for you. It's recurring themes: governance barriers, information, economic barriers, financial barriers, social and cultural barriers, and capability barriers. And then we started to try and understand the problem, where the problems really lied. And we really looked into the limited ability for cities to attract money and revenues to fund high impact projects. So there's a fragmentation around the projects and the type of projects that municipalities want to implement, especially smaller municipalities, with key drivers such as too much reliance on grant funding, especially smaller municipalities, low alignment with investor requirements. So there's a difficulty to really align to what the different type of investors, either equity or private or public, would be interested in, and more importantly, probably limited local capacity to develop proposals and projects that make sense. There's a number of issues then in the different bottlenecks area that further limit or further element these drivers, which may issues of governance, of course, economic barriers such as, in particular, the small population, informal employment, low FDI in many of these cities, along with others. Which results in a way also into fragmentation of programs and fragmentation of stakeholders. Turning this around, what we try to do now, I won't go into any detail of this, but what we're trying to do is try to identify a new initiative for the Mayors for Economic Growth in these 5 Eastern European countries that could actually help cities in that particular region to remove some of these bottlenecks, improve their ability to attract finance, and when the finance is there, managed in a certain way. So the idea of the Mayors for Economic Growth projects is really these 3 objectives: attracting more sustainable and diversified finance, sustainable and green projects implementation, and then reduction of vulnerability and dependence to central and donor funding. So it's really This program is really oriented towards enabling and empowering the municipalities to attract their finance and manage it in a certain way. And really the idea here is developing a diversified source of funding, developing network that basically empower them, develop the local capabilities that enable them to then attract that finance and manage it, and then deliver better, more sustainable projects. These are some of the ideas, and I'm going to finish with this. But what I really wanted to focus on here is the following point I'm going through in a minute. First of all is the project support. So the development of a project facility or some sort of project facility in which the quality of the proposals from the municipalities up to any source of revenue are actually improved. And this could be by development smart investment indicators, convenient platform for projects, establishing a cool down investment advisory for getting more support where the support is lacking, private sector engagement guidance, guidance on collaborative procurement and PPPs, working group with governments, IFAs, and other donors. It's a project support component. The second component is really around capability building for readiness, which is really developing a municipal finance toolkit. The second one would be grant systems, which are performance linked and performance judged around sustainability. And then the third component, which I think is the most important, and happy to have a chat later in the Q&A, is the project aggregation. When it comes in particular to the effects of climate change, especially for smaller municipalities, we are seeing a disintegration of approaches, a disintegration and fragmentation of different projects that are very limited. However, in my experience as a practitioner, what we've seen, especially when you go back to nature-based solutions as a way to build resilience and to reduce risk, scale is of essence. And scale is what is missing when you have smaller municipalities that each try to do their own project for flood management or for risk reduction in this and that area. First, they're not attractive for the private sector or the public sector. Secondly, they are less effective in what they want to achieve. So aggregation, it's really core here. So the aggregation here to us is done through portfolio and system thinking around programs and projects that bring more municipalities together, first of all. And secondly, try to identify different clusters of municipalities that can come together, especially to understand what climate change will do to these municipalities, and therefore what type of solutions can be done at territorial level with a special perspective. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Rajiv, happy to take any question. I'll be here for you during the course of the next minutes.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Very interesting work. The City Resilience Index that you referenced at the very outset has been our go-to resource for quite a number of years. Whenever we as practitioners work on urban resilience issues, that's the sort of a reference guide for us. Thanks for emphasizing the drivers, which support a resilience in integration, and for emphasizing the scenario-based planning and implementation, importance. Of course, you refer to the 4 issues which are critical to resilience financing, and these are very well noted: the upstream budgeting and the programming, national local financial allocation and their connect, funding emergency response and the long-term build back better, as well as risk transfer and reinsurance. Quite a few of these elements, remain an integral part of the work that we across our own interventions, support our cities on. Bottlenecks are of course very well noted. All of us are very well familiar, because as we engage at the city level, all of these challenges, all of the bottlenecks, as you articulated clearly, tend to confront us. And the approach that you advance to address some of these issues are also very critical, and will surely guide us in our thinking and work planning ahead. So thank you so much for sharing this deep dive work being advanced to strengthen cities' ability to mobilize investable financial resources. And thank you so much for your time. Now let's hear the voices from the front lines. So that is people and organizations working on engaging directly with the city leaders and administrations on facilitating access to funding streams. So for that, let me invite Mr. Carlos de Freitas. He's Executive Director, Global Fund for Cities Development. Carlos has been working since 1999 in sustainable development implementation of local and national level of action. He was the recipient of an EVINA Award in 2008 for investigative journalism, a fellow researcher at the Veblen Institute for Economic Reforms, and a former strategy director of an asset management company. In 2011, Carlos joined FMDB, that is the Global Fund for Cities Development, and he currently serves as the executive director of FMDB with 20 plus years of experience in the design of multi-stakeholder urban development, finance programs, and strategies. Carlos will today speak about the need for a renewed financial architecture for a resilient, just, and sustainable urbanization, and present FMDB's in-country programs. Mr. Carlos, you have the floor for the next 30 minutes. Over to you, and thank you for your time and joining us today.
Thank you, Rajiv. Basically, you're saying that I'm old and I've been for too long in the field, right? Thank you so much.
Not really. Not really.
No.
The old wine is always, the most.
Yeah, probably I'm wise.
Yeah.
Someday in my life, I'll be the wiser one in the room. Probably, I hope so. No, thank you. I'm just kidding. So FMDB is a global network of mayors and governors. So we are a political network. We were specifically created by UCLG, which is basically the UN for cities and regions and metropolis, the network of metropolitan areas around the world, to work specifically on the finance mechanisms for subnational action, basically. We are 14 years old now, 13 years old. So we are still at a very teenage age so far. So this is why I feel so young. But the idea was to provide a technical support to the political voice of mayors and governors when it came to have meetings with banks, may they be multilateral development banks or national development banks, also with the ministries of finance at the national level. The idea was also to make them more market makers, meaning front runners, innovators, building strategies and propositions maybe for public or private players of the financing value chain. And the last point was to become somehow consensus builders, to make sure that they would aggregate forces around the issues of urbanization mainly, and to make sure that the market that is urbanization finance would become somehow sexier for all the players. And we've been living a very transformative decade since the last UN cycle of international agendas, 2015-2016. The whole space has moved very quickly, even though 10 years can feel like a very long time. But still, since FFD Financing for a Development conference in Addis Ababa with the Article 34, which is really focusing on financing for development at the urban level of action, to the basically COP21 with the Paris Agreement, and the following steps, we have seen a huge progress in the recognition of this field of investment for private and public sectors. So what we have been doing as FMDB, as an organization, is basically first, during our first 5 years, to focus on advocacy and designing some propositions, key propositions, especially on 3 levels. Social and solidarity economy and finance, meaning how we can renew the concepts of economy and finance with an economy that is inclusive, that goes through a different way of designing financial mechanisms and economic development. The second one was on pooling projects, pooling facilities to support the scaling up of the financing of the projects at the local level, what is called aggregation or bundling, depending on the vocabulary that is used. And the third one was on the intermediation process, which is based on the financial institutions that are at the national level or at the local level, working at the local level with a mandate to support municipalities, which we called subnational development banks, which is now a very much integrated wording for designing those institutions. Because we need to remember that every time that you have a global conference or a global discussion, and actually right now on the financial architecture reform, you always invite to the table the big players. So multilateral development banks, basically, which are not working at the national level daily with the municipalities, the mayors and the governors. So for a long time, we missed several voices apart from the mayors and the governors at the table, at the finance tables in those big conferences to showcase what is happening really, what is really needed in terms of financial architecture for urbanization finance. And we have matured along the last decade until now, when after the global polycrisis that the UNSG has been calling them, we are now ready to go now from the national level to the local level, especially because of the debt insecurity that we have at the national levels, and also because the local players have been recognized now as the most efficient when it comes to apply and innovate in terms of resilient and sustainable and just policies. But even though we have a systemic approach on this, and we have all this knowledge of the right institutions that we need at the right levels of the financing value chain to make sure there is a continuity and not fragmentation, we still have a lot of issues. Part of the previous speakers told about them. So the trend now for most of the players is to go to at the country level to make sure that we basically build tailored policies, tailored mechanisms, tailored support to make sure that something is happening in the local context, and to pilot test some of those policies and tools. So we developed together with UCLG a platform, a collaborative platform that we called Finance Your Cities, that we launched in October 2022 in Abidjan during the Financing Common Summit. Basically, it's a contract that we have, a MOU that we have with the national government, usually the Ministries of Urban Development, but it can also be Ministries of Finance, where we are trying to build an agenda, a roadmap for action, and a policy dialogue, creating the space for the enabling environment. It's not to basically reinvent the wheel. It's more like being from the outside the country to support an acceleration and some more consciousness about the emergency stage where we are found now, all of us, especially regarding resilience and adaptation, obviously. And then to have two levels of action, which is having quick wins with the coaching, matchmaking, designing pipelines of pilot projects in cities to showcase the fact that at the national level, in the at the commercial banking sector level or public sector finance level, public finance sector level, we demonstrate that with some little very targeted support, we can achieve a lot of results, and especially when there is this multi-level and multi-stakeholder real dialogue and mechanism embedded in a program that is influential at the national level. So this market making, this influence is very key, and we need to rebrand the sexiness of the urbanization market. This is key because we come from centuries of prejudices on financing cities and regions, basically because ministries of finance didn't know about how to finance them. They were not interested because it was not a priority. Decentralization processes We're still very at the very inception phase, and little by little, there was also a lack in the education system for financial engineers to understand how it works really at the local level. So the Finance for Cities program is really on this part. And we have a module, which is what we call FinHubs, which are hubs of financial engineering expertise that can be set at the regional level or at the national level. To make sure that we, I don't see you possibly, but I guess I'm too long. But the idea here is to provide a team of experts that, which is basically a reference, a one-stop shop for all the players, and especially local governments and regional governments, but also ministries of urban development, because they are very weak usually at the national level, to make sure that they get the right support to understand what kind of sources exist, what kind of mechanisms exist, what kind of private sector investors you can reach out to. And it's a knowledge that they don't have time to go and look for and build on this, and because of the turnover in the public administration too. So the idea here is to build this capacity at the national level, serving these quick wins, but also in the medium term to have this kind of market intelligence integrated in the processes at the national level. We have little time, so I'll close here and I can answer other questions. But just to remind us that we are at the very beginning now of having all the players of the financing value chain really interested in joining the conversations with mayors and governors, but also ministers of urban development. So we are at a very changing and turning point time, but at the same time with this emergency with climate adaptation especially. So we need to accelerate, and to accelerate we need new pacts for action. And so we need to rebrand to make sure that we facilitate this dialogue from outside, but make sure that we strengthen the national players. This is the key component of our policy and strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I didn't mean to, cut you short. Interesting, the, points being raised here, especially, fully underscore the importance of, putting the needs of the city finances at the global and the national development agenda that you highlighted, bringing in the voices of mayors and other, city stakeholders to this discussions at all levels, especially in the age of this polycrisis, as you refer to, where a bottom-up resilience building and sustainable development approaches are becoming increasingly important, to all of us. And of course, the need to have the right kind of institutional architecture across the financial value chain. This very important points, very pertinent to the discussion. I'm sure all of us as practitioners will make due note of these, and of course, keep turning back to you for learning more about your work and how to advance these further. So thank you so much for your time to speak to us today. Now, let me turn, in the interest of time, quickly to Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance and invite Ms. Priscilla Negreiro, who is Senior Manager, Climate Policy Initiative with the CCFLA. She will be sharing her thoughts on the role of MDBs, multilateral development banks, in accelerating urban climate finance, especially in low and middle income countries. Please let us know about the initiatives being supported and advanced by you and your team to address resilience and sustainability issues at local and community levels. Over to you, Priscilla. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rajev, and UNDP and UNDRR for the opportunity to talk to so many of you today. I think I'm going to follow Carlos' structure and zoom a bit out of the individual projects and structures on how to solve the climate issue and discuss a bit the role of global financial system, so the public financial system, in working in supporting urban climate finance action. So I think it's a big challenge for cities to try to understand how the global financial structures from private and public side actually come down to the reality. And what we are trying to do within CCFLA is to discuss the role specifically on multilateral development banks. And I think it connects a lot on what Carlos said what is the architecture between national development banks, subnational development banks, and how multilateral development banks can work better together to leverage finance to the local level. So let me very quick share my screen. I'm not sure if you're like me, but I'm very visual, so it helps a lot to see images. So can you see my screen? Yes, great. So the goal here is to understand how to give this specific perspectives of MDB reform. So we have been discussing globally how multilateral development banks can work better, be more efficient, and scale the investment they are giving into the climate space. How can we and how should we connect it to the cities challenge? We know that the MDB, let's say the multilateral development bank pot of money, is not big enough. It shouldn't be. It's not enough of money, but like, how can we leverage this specific pot of funds, let's say, to leverage the climate transition? It was very interesting to hear Rob in the beginning of the session, because it's exactly the type of work that the World Bank and other MDBs are doing. So quick, just to give you a context, what I'm talking about. So addressing the global climate emergency requires urgent and comprehensive solutions. So just as you have an idea, as I said, I want to zoom out and have you and give you also the big picture. The average annual climate finance flows reach it for the first time 1.3 trillion in 2021, 2022, $1.3 trillion. And this is nearly double compared to 2019 and 20. So there is like an increase on the climate finance flows globally. But as you can see in the image, that's what I wanted to show you. This represents just 1% of the global GDP, the climate finance investments. And we need to actually increase 5-fold annually from public and private finance to be able to address the climate emergency. So within all of this numbers and space, MDBs, they have one role to play. They have increased their investments into climate from $57 billion in 2017-18 to $93 billion. So there is increase in the number of investments that MDBs are doing, but we need to do it more. And this is the key discussion within groups such as the G20, Bridgetown Initiative. So how can MDB, so multilateral development banks, fit for purpose to meet the challenges of the century? So like particularly the climate challenge. So the question is, like, why we're talking about is why cities should be within this reform discussions. And I don't think I need to repeat all of the stats that you know by heart. Cities are a core player and crucial to address the climate emergencies. And they're particularly vulnerable. That's where we touch on the resilience, and we have seen examples on today's presentation. And they are facing different hurdles and challenges to assess finance. And I think it was very interesting that within the 3 presentations, and I'm the last one, so I have this benefit of being able to cite most of you. We saw the aggregation issue, the poor creditworthiness, fiscal constraints, and the enabling environment that was mentioned as some of the key issues. So what the MDBs could do within these players, they have the financial resources and the technical expertise make them uniquely positioned to support the urban climate finance transition, partnering with different members. So that we launched last year, and by we I mean CCFLA in partnership with C40 and GCOM, a paper that provides the first of its kind review on the urban climate finance investments by the 10 multilateral development banks, in particularly low and middle income countries. So what we wanted to do is like, how can we actually start, when we start discussing the reform of the banks, we put cities on the core, on the center of this discussion. We know that the banks and the multilateral development banks, they're very different. They could be regional, they could be very global, the sizes of them, but we know that the collaborative action need to leverage the unique strengths for us to work better together. So we have a web scrap data from 2015 to 2022 to understand what kind of investments have the bank did, the type of financial instruments, where these investments are going to. And then I'm going to just show you some highlights of this. research. So the goal was to actually do proper recommendations for the MDBs on where we should improve the system so the flows can go to the city level. And then we have worked on 5 main areas. So the urban climate finance volumes and shares, how do we need to improve this? The strategies and coordinations of the banks connecting their climate and urban strategies, the operating models on the banks and how they are or not fit for purpose to respond to the urban challenges, the private capital mobilization that I think we have mentioned a bit within this discussion, and the policy support and capacity building. I'm not going to go deep in all of them because I don't have time, but I wanted to share some of the highlights. And I think on the first point on the volumes and shares, so like the quantity of of climate finance available to cities globally through MDBs, what we have seen with the data that we have collected is that 21% of the climate finance from MDBs to low and middle income countries has gone to urban projects from 2015 to 2022. So this is interesting because some people could say, oh, this is like a good amount of funding considering have other sectors to deal with. But the interesting is more on the trending, because despite the rising urbanization that we have seen and we continue to see worldwide, right? Like the volume tracked of MDB urban climate finance, urban climate related finance has remained quite stable. So like the message that I want to say here is like, how can we, in considering that the world is becoming more urbanized, like ask for more funding to actually tackle this challenge. Another trend that it's interesting within the volumes is that if we consider the destination of the finance flows, despite this, again, rapid urbanization, that it's very focused on sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and North Africa, these regions continue to receive relatively low urban climate related financing, which is quite interesting. On the climate uses, so like we can see that the banks have been working very hard to try to, on the mitigation adaptation side, so actually to have 50 and 50%. So it's compared to the global climate finance numbers, adaptation and mitigation, it's a lot more balanced with the banks, which is very interesting, but we still need a lot more funding for adaptation. On the strategies, so on the second point, so I came back to the recommendation, so on how to improve focus in strategy and coordination, I wanted just to mention that something interesting, which is on our findings, is that 8 of the 10 MDBs that we have analyzed have standalone urban strategies. So they are working within the city space and they have climate objectives on these strategies. However, when we analyze the climate strategies from the banks, only 4 from the 10 banks that we analyze have urban as a priority. So there is actually a need also on the narrative of the banks and how they prioritize the climate structure. We need to be thinking more on the urban challenge. So this was something interesting that we have come up. On the third area, on the operating model, that's going to be, it's another point that I wanted to showcase to you, and I'm sure that you have a lot of experience on this, is we have dig into the sizes of the projects that MDBs have been financing. And cities are struggling a lot to access MDB financing under the project by project approach. What it means that MDBs tend to prioritize large infrastructure projects, and this has been quite challenging for cities. Because if we talk to cities, and I think you could tell me even better than I can, the investment requires are often below the MDB funding thresholds. So a programmatic approach, and that's something that we have been discussing with MDBs and with others, is very much needed on the urban climate finance investments. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Pasquale has also mentioned on the aggregating projects, right? Like putting together different initiatives and projects or municipalities that can actually aggregate and become a larger ticket size, as we say in the financial sector. So interlinking projects with cities' climate action plans and having available technical assistance and a full programmatic structure that can help cities not only to find the financing they need, but also to structure their their strategy around their climate transition. So finally, just on the last two, I just want to briefly to mention that on the private sector mobilization, what we are discussing in this paper and what we want to encourage is the promotion of risk mitigation instruments. This is particularly important when we are talking about resilience, and it was mentioned by previous presenters. So like how guarantees, blended finance, insurance mechanisms can support addressing the risk, that it's not only connected to the climate risk, but it's in the financial risk within the projects, and deal with creditworthiness, limited capital capacity. And this has been underutilized to date, and guarantees, blended finance need a lot of public funding and financing. So this is quite a key area where we need more public institutions thinking it through and finding solutions. And finally, on the last point, on the fifth, on the enhancing capacity, policy supporting capacity building, it goes into what was mentioned before about the enabling environment. So this is like actually a key area for cities. This goes into the resilience project we're developing. It was mentioned, I think, by all of the presenters, is like, how can cities have the institutional and fiscal capacity and to deal with all of the challenges that they need to be. And we deeply believe that MDBs can and should support national policy reforms. They have been doing that throughout the years, but focusing very much into urban climate action. So using, for example, policy-based instruments like loans to support the city climate action, strengthening the subnational capacities. So I hope that it gives you, I think we went from very much from the example on the city side dealing with resilience, like zooming a bit out on how the financial system has been working and dealing. And I think this discussion is particularly important for the cities to be aware of, because not necessarily the system that we are into today is working and fit for purpose to tackle the urban climate finance process. And we should be discussing and talking on how to make it better. And we will only be able to do it with city support and cities' awareness on that front. So yes, that's for me. Thank you so much, Rajev.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. Excellent, comprehensive, points and food for thought, surely all across. Definitely, you underscored the need to put urban climate finance needs on the top of the table and the agenda, especially among the MDBs and their strategic frameworks, etc. I will not repeat all the pertinent points that you've already shared. There are quite a few questions which the participants have shared, and I want to spend some time to address some of them, if not all, because of the time constraints. So Pascal, if you could turn your camera on, there is a question, two questions for you. One, would you comment on the use of land value capture as a mechanism for municipal finance? And second, in terms of implementation, how can small cities access finances for their adaptation measures? Do we have an illustration of a city that collaborated with the private sector to come up with innovative financial solutions? Any thoughts, any ideas to respond to these 2 points before we come to the others?
Thank you, Rajiv. I was answering the last questions from the anonymous attendee, but then
Okay.
my answer disappeared. But so can you please repeat the first question? I can't locate it.
So the first one is, would you comment on the use of land value capture as a mechanism for municipal finance?
This is a great question. A question that can't be answered unless we first ask ourselves where. So it's been my experience that in developing countries, land value capture is subject to the distribution of premium land from which you can actually capture value through policies that are not necessarily poor oriented or driven by principles of equality. Whereas in other areas where you have a strong environmental and planning capacity and development control capacity, value capture is probably more of an instrument. So to answer your question, I think that in the latter, there's been ample evidence. I think UN Habitat published quite a lot on this that land value capture through different instruments in development is a very powerful instrument. but this, in my opinion, has not been the silver bullet everywhere, which is why I introduced my answer by saying it works in countries which have a very strong development control and planning capacity, and where land allocation and premium land from which you can extract value is allocated on principles of equality and etc. Not so much in cities where these principles is not that strong. Happy to elaborate on this, but unfortunately I don't have a black and white answer. Strong instrument doesn't work everywhere. Let me put it this way. It's been my experience.
Thank you so much, Pascal. There was another, question for Priscilla, and you have already shared the links to those, publications. There was a question about that. So thank you so much. Another one, again, for Pascal, a solution you mentioned included spatial frameworks for corridor development. Could you please elaborate how small municipalities can leverage this for strengthening financing? Briefly, please.
Thank you for this question. I mean, this is the one I was writing and it disappeared. There's a very strong rationale that demonstrates that finance follows very credible projects with a very strong rationale and credibility. However, when you're a smaller municipality, often you don't have the critical mass to attract larger finance and larger program that you need, both for a simple critical mass issue, scale, and other issues is that you can't really justify the investment on, say, on a public infrastructure on a particular project in an area where your one small municipality is not enough justification to do that. Now, if you look at this from a spatial perspective, you see that services and functions are concentrated in a certain way along economic clusters. Identifying these economic clusters and then based on that, identifying why you need a project there in partnership with other smaller municipalities in that particular area has a much stronger chance of winning the attention of public, national finance, but also international funds. Again, there's a number of tools that proven that. They've been proven in Nepal, in Northern Africa, in a number of regions, and it works very well. It's a strong, powerful instrument that to show that especially this is where you need to invest, and this takes the burden off one small municipality and put it in a network, justifying much more investment.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Thanks all panelists. There are quite a few other questions, one especially related to the technology transfer support which can be provided by international organizations like UNDRR and others. I think this can definitely be addressed, and we'll come back on this surely over a period of time, because we are now running out of time. So there was one for Rob because he was speaking about the resilience of financing, but he's not there with us. So definitely, Aaron, we will come back to you on this later on. We will share this question, and if you could put your email ID in the chat box, then we will send a response to you surely. So in the interest of time, let me now bring this webinar to a close. First of all, thanking our eminent panel of experts and practitioners for sharing deep insights onto this very complex issue. It is not very easy to deliberate upon municipal financing, knowing the different aspects and dimensions connected therewith. This definitely needs to be further looked at, and we will continue to work on this with you and other stakeholders over a period of time. I would also like to thank UNDRR and their team for all the backend support that they've provided to make this webinar happen in within a short span of time. The ID support and other management support from the backend, and thanks to Priscilla, Carlos, Pascal. Within a short span of time, you indicated your availability, shared your ideas, experiences, and leads. We will surely be in touch with you and continue to benefit from your experience and expertise over time. So thank you so much, colleagues. The recording to the webinar will be shared soon. You will be able to access all presentations and the points articulated, and happy to stay engaged. And please, if you have any specific issue which
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rajiv and team.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well done, guys. Thank you. Thank you.